Well, I think whether you think there's going to be a Cold War between the United States and China really depends on how you define the term. Unfortunately, the U.S. Soviet Cold War is the only model that most people have to cite and often invoke. I actually don't believe we're going to have that kind of a Cold War between the United States and China, because I think the nature of the challenge from China and the nature of the competition with China will be fundamentally different than it was between the United States and the Soviet Union. But I think there's other models. That's not the only model, the only definition of a Cold War. And I was intrigued to be reminded that George Orwell, the British writer and novelist, who arguably coined the phrase Cold War in 1945, defined it merely as a peace that is no peace. And my argument is that we're kind of headed toward that between the United States and China. I think we are going to have a systemic and structural competition between the two sides for wealth and power, between two global powers, really. I think both sides are approaching it as a zero-sum game, or appear to be. They certainly appear to be approaching it as an ideological competition. And I think both sides are going to be trying to score points against each other by invoking, soliciting the support, cultivating the support of third countries. Again, it's going to be a very different competition than it was with the Soviet Union, but I think it meets some of those requirements. And I think actually the most important point I would add is that I think that there's going to be what amounts to a Cold War, because the politics on both sides seems to be preventing or disinclining both governments from doing what I think is going to be necessary to avert it. So I guess my bottom line is that if I use George Orwell's definition of a peace that is no peace, I think there is going to be a Cold War with not capital letters between the United States and China. And you also asked whether I thought a Cold War would break out. I think part of my definition would be that it's not something that's going to break out. I think it's simply going to emerge out of these circumstances and take that shape over time. And I think that's already where we're headed. The first thing I would say is that strategic empathy is just a hard thing to do. It takes time and effort to get yourself into the mindset of another party, certainly of another country. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's difficult for the two sides to understand each other, or even attempt to understand each other. I think there's obviously underlying that there are ideological and cultural and even racial divisions between the two countries, which feed a suspicion and a xenophobia between the two sides, and a lack of understanding, make it harder. There certainly is also a lack of, historically, a lack of strategic trust, and historical trust between the two sides, given the relationship. I think also more recently, this is a newer element. I think that there is, I think this is driven in part by the inherent internal vulnerability of both countries under the current circumstances, which I think inflates the threat perceptions, which in turn are fueling this misattribution of motives and misunderstanding between the two sides. And in fact, I think that's even further complicated by the fact that because of the politics on both sides, there is a kind of risk that's perceived of it's involved in demonstrating strategic empathy for the other side, because empathy is always it's easy to confuse empathy with sympathy, and I think it's a liability on both sides to be perceived as sympathetic to the other side. In terms of the dangers that this poses, I think it obviously fuels misunderstanding and mistrust, which I think in turn is going to fuel tensions and ultimately or inevitably or most likely conflict. I think the other byproduct of or consequence of the lack of strategic empathy and mutual comprehension is that it obstructs objective and realistic approaches to policies toward each other by both Beijing and Washington, which brings us full circle to the point. I think that that's why it's one of the key drivers of this drift toward a Cold War. That's a hard question to address, but if I was asked by the Biden administration for advice on how to avert a Cold War, I think there'd be a couple of points I would emphasize. I think first and foremost, I think we need to pull back from characterizing the U.S. China relationship as an existential struggle or as a zero-sum contest or as an primarily an ideological struggle. I think we also have to pull back from characterizing it as primarily a military competition. Those are things that kind of lead us into the trap of comparing it to the U.S.-Soviet relationship. And I think that it doesn't meet the requirements of that. I think the other advice I would say is that I think that we need to recognize in this contest, and it will be competition. I think we have to understand that cooperation is going to be as important as competition if we're going to avoid falling into a trap here of a real Cold War. And in that regard, I would note that the kind of slogan that Secretary Blinken has attached to the relationship is that the U.S.-China relationship will be competitive where it should be, collaborative where it can be, and adversarial where it must be. That makes sense, but I think that overlooks several very important categories. Two of them are areas where the relationship should or must be collaborative and where it need not be adversarial or competitive. I think we need to kind of parse out those categories and acknowledge the importance of cooperation in tandem with competition to avoid falling into a more conflictual Cold War. The last point I would make is that I frankly would like to see the Biden administration take some political risk in pursuing this. Just last week, Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haas gave an interview in which he said, and I just want to quote this, "You don't run foreign policy by public opinion poll. You run foreign policy by what you think is smart and right. And then you go out and sell it and you defend it and you explain it." Now, I'm a firm believer in that. And I think it would behoove the administration to consider how to do what's smart and right in dealing with China in following that advice. But unfortunately, I frankly am not optimistic that that's going to happen because of the political constraints here in Washington, which are an obstacle to it. Politics here is so delicately balanced that I don't know that political risk is going to be seen as viable. And the same applies on the Chinese side.